I didn't call before I came. I just drove there because something in my gut told me to. And after 20 years of transcribing other people's worst days for a living, I've learned not to argue with that feeling. I hadn't heard from my daughter Emily in 4 days. Not one text, not one call. That wasn't like her. Emily texts me pictures of her coffee. She sends me articles about court reporters going extinct just to needle me. 4 days of silence from Emily is like 4 days of silence from a smoke detector. Either the battery's dead or something's burning. The second I stepped inside her house, my key still worked because I'd never asked for it back. I heard crying, quiet crying, the kind you try to hide from someone in the next room. I stood in the entryway with my coat still on, listening, letting my eyes adjust to the dim hallway light. I followed the sound to the kitchen, and I froze. My daughter stood at the sink in a thin cotton sweater, hands buried in gray dishwater up to the wrist. Snow was falling outside, fat and sideways, the kind San Diego never gets, and I still don't trust after 11 years of watching it fall in other cities. The window above the sink was cracked wide open. Her breath was fogging in her own kitchen. She was shaking so hard the glasses in the sink rattled together like wind chimes. I hadn't seen her this thin since her second year of law school, the year she lived on ramen and ambition, and forgot that both of those things run out. 10 feet away at the table, her husband Daniel sat eating roast chicken with his mother, Patricia. Warm, comfortable. The smell filled the whole room. Rosemary, butter, the particular smell of a meal someone spent real time on. Emily hadn't touched a plate. Daniel had dragged a space heater over from the living room and angled it at his own chair. And at his mother's. Not at his wife's. Not at the woman standing with her back to them, 10 feet from a cracked window in December, doing dishes with numb hands. Daniel lifted his empty plate without even glancing at her. Stop washing those. Bring me more chicken. Emily didn't move fast enough. I don't know what fast enough would have even looked like, given that her hands were shaking too hard to hold a sponge steady, let alone a knife. Daniel stood, crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, leaned down until his face was inches from hers. Then he screamed, right into her ear, loud enough that the window rattled harder in its frame. I said more chicken. Are you deaf now too? Emily didn't cry out. She just went still. The specific stillness of someone who has learned through repetition that flinching makes it worse. That was the part that broke something loose in my chest. Not the volume, not the cruelty, but the fact that my daughter's body already knew the choreography of this. She'd rehearsed going still. Somebody had trained that reflex into her, one Tuesday at a time, until it stopped looking like fear and started looking like furniture. Patricia took another bite of chicken. Then she smiled, not at anyone in particular, just a small, satisfied smile, like a woman watching television she'd already seen the ending of. I stopped breathing for 1 second. Then 20 years of sitting silently in courtrooms, recording every word so precisely that a transcript could survive a Supreme Court appeal, kicked in and did what it always does. It made me useful instead of useless. I pulled out my phone, hit record, walked in, get away from my daughter. Daniel spun around. Whatever anger had been on his face melted the second he registered mine. And then worse, it curdled into something almost pleasant. Rebecca, maybe knock next time. Emily turned toward me. Her eyes were swollen, the kind of swollen that comes from crying for a long time and then trying to stop before anyone notices. Her whole body was still shaking, even with the tap shut off, even with no more cold water running over her hands. She said 4 words that terrified me more than anything I'd just watched happen in that kitchen. Mom, please don't leave. Not help me. Not get me out of here. Don't leave. As if the most realistic outcome, the one she'd been bracing for, was that I would see this and go home anyway. Patricia wiped her mouth with a cloth napkin, unhurried, like she was finishing brunch at a restaurant with cloth napkins and a wine list. Don't be dramatic. Emily's been difficult lately. We're just teaching her how to run a proper household. I set my phone down on the dining table. Screen up, camera pointed directly at the 3 of them. Then I walked past Daniel and shut the window. Emily, get your coat. Daniel stepped into the hallway and blocked the front door with his body, arms crossed, chin up, a man performing confidence for an audience of 2 women who already knew exactly how much confidence he actually had. She's not going anywhere. I stared at him. I have stared down defense attorneys who make more in a month than I make in a year, and none of them ever rattled me the way 29-year-old Daniel Voss did in that moment, mostly because I understood, watching him, that he had never once in his life expected to be looked at like this, like evidence, like something being read into the record. She has no money, he said, like he was reciting terms of a contract, nowhere to live, and she's not taking anything I paid for. Then he pointed a finger at me, actually pointed, the way you'd point at a dog that had wandered onto your lawn. Interfere and I'll call the police. Have you arrested for trespassing? His voice was calm, rehearsed, like he'd delivered this exact speech before. To Emily, probably, more than once, until the cadence of it had smoothed out like a stone in a river. I almost laughed in his face. I didn't, because laughing would have felt like giving something away too early, and I have spent 2 decades learning that the most dangerous thing you can do in a room like that one is let people see your whole hand before you're ready to play it. He had no idea whose house he was standing in. I didn't say a word about that. Not yet. I helped Emily into her boots while Daniel threatened divorce like it was a loaded weapon he was pointing at the ceiling for effect. Patricia trailed behind us down the hall, narrating a list of everything Emily had supposedly ruined. Her cooking, her spending, her attitude, her ingratitude, as if gratitude were rent she owed for the privilege of being controlled. Emily's hands were shaking too hard to manage her own zipper. I did it for her. her, the way I used to when she was 6 and her mittens were always the wrong size. At the door, she leaned close, her voice dropping to almost nothing, eyes flicking back toward the kitchen like she thought Daniel could hear through drywall. "Mom, what is it? He took my phone 3 weeks ago," she swallowed. "He changed the passwords on our bank accounts, and he hid my car keys. I haven't left this house by myself since October." I turned back toward Daniel, slow and level. "You just made this a lot bigger than a bad marriage." For the first time since I'd walked in, his smile disappeared. What neither of them knew, what I hadn't told them, because some cards you don't show until the hand is already lost, was that my phone was still recording, still sitting on their dining table exactly where I'd left it, and it was still listening when Patricia leaned toward her son and whispered 5 words she never should have said out loud in a room with a live microphone in it. "Don't worry, Daniel. By Friday, the house will finally belong to us." I got Emily into my car. I did not go back for the phone that second. I drove 2 blocks, parked behind a shuttered dry cleaner, and sat there with my hands on the wheel until my own were steady enough to drive the rest of the way. Then I turned around and went back for my phone. Daniel handed it to me at the door without a word, jaw tight, eyes doing the math on how much of that conversation I might have caught. I didn't tell him. I have learned that silence is a tool, same as a subpoena, and you don't waste either one on a man who hasn't earned an explanation yet. I should explain the house because it matters more than either of them understood in that kitchen. 11 years ago, when my husband Frank died, he left me the house we'd lived in for 2 decades outright. No mortgage, paid off in full the year before the diagnosis, like he'd known something the rest of us didn't. I couldn't stay in it. Every room had a version of him still standing in it. So I sold our house and used part of the proceeds, along with money from Frank's small life insurance policy, to buy Emily and Daniel their first home as a wedding gift 3 years ago. Except I didn't put the house in Daniel's name. I put it in a revocable trust, with Emily as sole beneficiary and myself as trustee until she turned 35, a decision Frank and I had actually discussed years before he got sick, back when Emily was still in college and dating men we liked considerably less than we let on. "Just in case," he'd said. Not because we don't trust her judgment, because judgment isn't always the thing that fails. Daniel had spent 3 years believing he lived in a house he'd earned. He had never once asked to see the deed. Why would he? Men like Daniel don't check paperwork. They check who's in the room when decisions get made. And for 3 years, that had always been him. Patricia's whispered sentence in that kitchen, "By Friday, the house will finally belong to us," meant one of 2 things. Either she believed something was about to happen to the trust that neither Emily nor I had authorized, or something already had. I needed to find out which, fast, and I needed someone with real authority behind them to help me do it. That first night, Emily slept in my guest room for 11 straight hours, the kind of sleep that isn't rest so much as a body finally being permitted to stop performing wakefulness. I sat in my kitchen and listened to the full recording, start to finish, twice. The part with Daniel screaming was bad, expected bad, in the way that doesn't make it less awful, just less surprising. The part after we left was worse. Once the front door shut, Patricia's voice changed register entirely, dropped the theatrical concern, the brunch napkin composure, and settled into something flatter and far more businesslike. "She's going to go running to her mother. That's fine. Let her." "Fine? Mom, she just walked out with, 'Let her walk. She can't take a house that isn't hers, Daniel. And by Friday, it won't be hers mother's either.'" I played that last line 4 times trying to parse the grammar of it, because the sentence structure itself was a clue. Won't be hers mother's either. A slip spoken fast, meaning the trust, meaning me, meaning something scheduled to change ownership of that house by a specific date that was now 3 days away. I told myself it might be nothing. People say vague, cruel things when they're angry and don't mean anything specific by it. I have transcribed enough depositions to know that most threatening language in the moment is just noise people make to feel powerful. Then I called the title company that had handled the trust paperwork 11 years ago, gave them the property address, and asked if there had been any recent activity on the file. There had been. A request, filed 6 days earlier to add a name to the deed. My hands weren't shaking. They'd gone past shaking into something stiller and colder, the way water gets right before it freezes solid. The clerk at the title company couldn't tell me much over the phone. Privacy rules, understandably, but she confirmed the request had come in through a local title examiner's office, not through my original attorney, which meant someone had gone looking for a different path into that file, one that didn't run through the trustee, one that didn't run through me. I drove to my old attorney's office the next morning without an appointment, the same way I'd driven to Emily's house 2 days earlier, because apparently my gut had decided this was a week for showing up uninvited. His name is Harold Meyer, 61 years old, 34 years in estate and trust law, the same man who drafted the trust language for Emily's house back when Frank was still alive to sign it. Harold doesn't do dramatic. Harold does careful, which after the week I'd had felt like the most dramatic thing a person could offer me. He pulled the file, read it twice. Then he looked up at me over his glasses in a way I recognized from watching him read bad news to other people for 2 decades. "Rebecca, has anyone asked you recently to sign anything related to this trust? Anything at all? A form, a letter, anything with a notary stamp?" "No, nothing." "Has Emily?" I called her. She was awake now, curled up on my couch with a blanket, and the specific hollow-eyed look of someone doing math on the last 3 years of her life. "Emily, did you sign anything for Daniel in the last 2 weeks? A form, a letter, anything with your name on it that you don't remember reading closely?" There was a long pause. "There was something in October, before he took my phone. He said it was for for our joint taxes. An authorization form, he called it. He said I needed to sign it fast because the deadline was that day. I didn't read the whole thing. I trusted him. I relayed that to Harold. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man confirming a diagnosis he'd already been suspecting. That's not a tax form, Rebecca. Based on the filing date and the description, that's very likely a limited power of attorney. If Emily signed something granting Daniel authority to act on her behalf regarding property matters, even a narrow one, and if he's now using that authorization to petition for a deed amendment on a trust where she's the named beneficiary, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I'd spent 20 years transcribing the exact moment attorneys stopped finishing sentences because the ending was self-evident, and saying it out loud felt like an insult to everyone's intelligence in the room. I need this stopped before Friday, I said. Then we need a restraining order on the filing, and we need it faster than the county typically moves, which means we need a judge to understand why this is urgent, not just inconvenient. Harold filed an emergency motion that afternoon to freeze any pending action on the deed, citing the trust documents and a fraud concern regarding the October authorization. It bought us time. The county wouldn't process the amendment until a judge reviewed the freeze request, which meant Friday's deadline, whatever it had actually meant to Daniel and Patricia, was no longer a hard wall. It also meant Daniel now knew, for certain, that we knew. He called Emily's new phone, the one I'd bought her that morning at a Verizon store, replacing the one he'd confiscated 3 weeks earlier, 4 times in 1 hour. She didn't answer. On the 5th call, she put it on speaker, hands still trembling slightly even now, 4 days out from that kitchen, and let me listen. Emily, baby, this is insane. Your mom is turning this into something it's not. I love you. You know I love you. This is just stress, okay? The business stress, the money stress, I'm not that guy. There was a long silence on Emily's end. You called me deaf, Daniel, in front of my mother, because I didn't refill your plate fast enough. I was frustrated. That doesn't mean, Emily, please, I need you to come home. We can fix this before anyone gets lawyers involved. Before it becomes a whole thing. As though it hadn't already been a thing for months, possibly years. And the only new variable was that someone with a law degree now knew about it. Emily hung up without answering him. Then she sat very still on my couch and said something that told me exactly how deep the damage went. Part of me wants to go back. Isn't that insane? Part of me is sitting here thinking about how cold it's going to be in that kitchen tonight without me there to close the window. I didn't tell her that thought was insane because it wasn't insane. It was textbook. The exact thing I'd read about in the coercive control literature I'd started devouring at 2 in the morning, 3 separate books downloaded onto my phone before sunrise. I told her the truth instead. That's not love talking. That's habit talking. They sound the same for a while. They're not the same. 4 days after I pulled her out of that kitchen, Emily and I sat across from Detective Maria Ibarra, 17 years with the county's domestic violence and coercive control unit. A woman with the specific calm of someone who has heard every version of this story and has never once let that familiarity turn into boredom. I want to be straightforward with you both, Detective Ibarra said, sliding a folder across the table. Financial control, isolation, verbal abuse, and now what looks like an attempt to fraudulently transfer property. That's a pattern our office takes seriously, especially with a signed authorization potentially obtained under false pretenses. But I also want you to understand what we're looking at as separate tracks. The financial fraud piece runs through the DA's economic crimes unit. The coercive control and the restraining order run through us. They'll move on different timelines. How different? I asked. The restraining order can move fast. Days. If the judge agrees there's credible risk. The fraud investigation into the power of attorney and the deed filing will take longer. Weeks. Possibly longer, depending on what we find when we pull banking records. Emily's hands, resting on the table, had gone still in a way I'd started to recognize as its own kind of alarm. Not calm, but frozen. The stillness of someone bracing for a verdict. There's something else, Detective Ibarra said, and pulled a second thinner folder from beneath the first. You mentioned Patricia Voss's whispered comment on the recording. The house will finally belong to us. We ran a basic background check on her. Standard procedure whenever a coercive control complaint names a co-resident. This isn't Patricia's first time in a house like this. She turned the folder toward us. Inside was a civil court filing from 11 years earlier. A different county, a different daughter-in-law's name at the top of the page. Patricia Voss's first husband's estate, before Daniel's father, included a property dispute involving Patricia's own mother-in-law at the time. The details are different, the outcome was messier, but the pattern isn't. Isolate the spouse, control the finances, move on the property while everyone's too exhausted to check the paperwork. I sat with that for a long moment, watching my daughter absorb the fact that the woman eating roast chicken in her kitchen 3 weeks ago had, apparently, run this exact play before on someone else's daughter, in someone else's kitchen, years before Emily had even met Daniel. He's not the architect, Emily said quietly. He's the contractor. Detective Ibarra didn't correct her. The forensic piece came together 9 days after the kitchen, when a certified forensic accountant named Dennis Okafor, 22 years in financial fraud analysis, most of them spent testifying as an expert witness in exactly the kind of case Harold said we were now building, finished tracing the joint account Daniel had locked Emily out of in October. He met with Harold, Detective Ibarra's office, and me in Harold's conference room, laptop open, 3 separate account statements printed and highlighted in 3 separate colors. The visual grammar of a man who has learned that judges and juries respond better to color coding than to spreadsheets. There were two things happening in this account, Dennis said. The first is straightforward. Daniel restricted Emily's access in October, around the same time the power of attorney was allegedly signed, and began routing his own spending through it exclusively. That's consistent with financial control, but on its own, it's a civil matter, not necessarily a criminal one. And the second thing, Harold said, the second thing is that 18 months ago, this account held $31,400 that Emily's records show she'd specifically earmarked, her own words, in a linked savings note for her bar exam prep and a solo practice startup fund. Money she'd saved from 3 years of paralegal work before law school, plus a small gift from her father's estate. Emily's face changed. I watched a piece of information land on her that she genuinely hadn't had before that moment. That money's gone, Dennis continued. Not spent gradually. Moved in 4 transfers between November and January into an account held jointly by Daniel and Patricia Voss. The pattern of the transfers, timed suspiciously close to withdrawal limits that would avoid triggering the bank's standard fraud alerts, is not, in my professional opinion, consistent with routine household spending. He knew what he was taking, Emily said. It wasn't a question. Based on the timing and structuring of these transfers, Dennis said carefully, yes, this has the signature of someone who understood exactly what they were moving and why they were moving it in pieces small enough not to raise flags. I thought about the space heater pointed at Daniel's own chair. I thought about the roast chicken and the empty plate he'd lifted without looking at his wife, and I understood for the first time with total clarity that none of it had ever been about a bad marriage or a stressed out husband having a hard month. It had been accounting. Emily's exhaustion, her isolation, her hunger, all of it had been the overhead cost of a theft that had started long before that kitchen and would have kept running quietly if I hadn't shown up on the wrong Tuesday with the wrong feeling in my gut. The restraining order came through 11 days after the kitchen. Judge Renata Castillo, 20 years on the family court bench, a woman Harold described as having very little patience for men who confuse marriage licenses for deeds, reviewed the recording, the power of attorney timeline, and Dennis's financial report in a single afternoon hearing and granted a temporary order that afternoon with a full hearing scheduled for 3 weeks out. Daniel wasn't in the courtroom. His attorney was a tired-looking man named Craig Pell, who spent most of the hearing objecting to the admissibility of a recording made, as he put it, without the express consent of all parties in the room. Judge Castillo looked at him over her glasses in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of Harold. Counsel, your client screamed at his wife loud enough to rattle a window, in a home he does not hold sole title to, in front of the woman who does. I'm not excluding the recording. I'm barely tolerating the objection. I would be lying if I said that line didn't feel, for one small and slightly embarrassing second, like justice arriving early and wearing a black robe. The part I hadn't planned for, the part no one plans for, arrived 19 days after the kitchen on a Thursday night when Emily called me at 11:40 p.m. from a number I didn't recognize. Mom, Daniel's outside. He's parked across the street from your house. He's been there for almost an hour. I saw him from the window. I had 20 minutes, maybe less, before I'd need to decide whether to call the police over a car parked on a public street, which is, legally, not against anything, restraining order or not, as long as he stayed on that side of the line, or whether waiting for him to actually do something meant waiting too long. I had lived through exactly this kind of impossible math once before, the year Frank got sick, sitting in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, trying to decide whether a symptom was an emergency or just Tuesday. I hadn't liked that math then either. I called Detective Ibarra's after-hours line. She answered on the second ring, which told me everything about how seriously her unit treats exactly this scenario. Don't approach him. Don't go outside. Stay inside, lock the doors, and I'm sending a unit now. A parked vehicle near a protected party's residence, that close to a temporary order, is enough for us to respond and document, even if it's not technically a violation yet. My hands were shaking again for the first time since that first night. Emily sat beside me on the couch, both of us watching the street through a gap in the curtains, and for one long, terrible stretch of minutes, I understood exactly what she'd meant, weeks earlier, about part of her wanting to go back. Not because going back was safe, but because the waiting, the not knowing, the sheer physical cost of vigilance made almost anything feel preferable to more of it. The patrol car arrived 9 minutes later. Daniel's car was gone by the time it did. He hadn't done anything. Legally, nothing had happened at all, but something in me had already changed permanently in those 9 minutes. The way something changes permanently in a house after the first time you check that the doors are locked twice instead of once. The full hearing, 3 weeks after the temporary order, lasted 6 hours and ended with something closer to a verdict than either Harold or I had dared hope for. Judge Castillo granted a 3-year restraining order against Daniel, citing the coercive control pattern, the financial isolation, and what she called reading directly from her notes. A documented pattern of psychological and material control consistent with domestic abuse, notwithstanding the absence of physical violence, which this court does not require to find such a pattern established. The deed amendment request was formally denied and the file flagged for fraud review, based on Emily's sworn statement that she had not knowingly authorized any transfer of trust property and had signed the October document under the belief it concerned a tax filing. The Economic Crimes Unit 6 weeks later filed charges against Daniel for financial exploitation exploitation, and fraudulent use of a power of attorney. Patricia was named as a co-conspirator based on the recorded statement and the pattern evidence from her first marriage, though her attorney negotiated a deferred prosecution agreement, restitution of the traced funds, 5 years probation, and a permanent injunction barring her from holding any financial power of attorney for a family member again. Daniel's case is still moving through the system as I write this. His attorney has floated a plea deal that would include restitution and a felony conviction with no additional jail time, which Harold tells me is a realistic and not unusually lenient outcome for a first offense of this kind, however unsatisfying that sentence is to say out loud. Daniel lost his job 2 months into the proceedings, not because of any of this directly, but because the company's HR department, once the restraining order became a matter of public record, reviewed his access to certain client financial accounts as a matter of routine risk management and did not like the pattern they found on their own internal audit. I take no pleasure in reporting that I do, in fact, feel something adjacent to pleasure about it anyway. Emily got her $31,400 back through the restitution order, 8 months after the kitchen, though Harold was careful to tell her, more than once, that the number on the check would never be able to buy back the 8 months. It's been 10 months now. Emily lives with me still, in the guest room that has slowly stopped looking like a guest room and started looking like a room someone actually lives in. A lamp she picked out, a stack of bar exam study guides she's finally reading with her own eyes open the whole way, a space heater of her own that she keeps pointed, deliberately, at whichever chair she happens to be sitting in. The house, her house, the one in the trust, sits empty right now, listed with a realtor, because Emily told me, in the calm and slightly exhausted voice she's grown into this year, that she doesn't want to live in a kitchen she associates with a cracked window and a plate she wasn't allowed to eat from. I understood that completely. I'd done the same thing with a different house 11 years earlier, for reasons that weren't so different after all. She still flinches sometimes, at loud voices, at unexpected footsteps behind her in a kitchen. Detective Ibarra told us gently that this part doesn't have a court date. There's no hearing where a judge declares the flinching officially over, but she eats first, now, before anyone else at the table. I make sure of it, every single time, without ever having to say why out loud, and every window in my house stays shut, all winter, whether anyone's cold or not.